For our keynote speaker this morning, it was a typical Midwestern Lutheran upbringing in Wisconsin. It was kind of a red, white, and blue God and motherhood, Norman Rockwell environment. And in that environment, it was possible for a man to just have some big dreams, to dream some very great things. And that young man did. After leaving high school, he was accepted at West Point. Then later, he was selected by NASA to enter the Astronaut program, where he spent 2 years at the Johnson Space Center training and being evaluated, and then another 2 years in learning and understanding all of the challenges and what was necessary to become one of America's greatest astronauts. In 2000, Jeff Williams finally made the big time because he was asked to serve as the flight and lead spacewalker on Space Shuttle Atlantis for STS-101. I think he'll tell us a little bit about that later. And then in 2002, Jeff began training for long-duration experience in space. For 3 years, he traveled between Houston and Star City in Russia, preparing for that experience. And his experience and training prepared him for Expedition 13 flight engineer and science officer above us in the International Space Station. And I think this video will help tell the rest of his story before we bring him to the stage. Thank you.
Orbital outpost, we are the experiment.
Welcome a real God American to the stage, Colonel Jeffrey N. Williams. Jeff.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for Anna Marie and I to be here with you this weekend. I want to start by saying thank you for your service and your ministry, particularly in your local congregations. We all seek to be faithful servants of Christ, and I know by virtue of you being here and participating in an organization like this, it helps to enable the mission and ministry of the church that you are serving, not only in this capacity here in CEF, but also in your local congregations. And that ultimately is where where the rubber meets the road, right? Where we deal with people, we witness to people, we encourage people, we challenge people, and all of that. So thank you for your service. Like Paul mentioned earlier, I'm also not a celebrity in our home. In fact, there's a story that goes back a few years ago. We have two sons, they're grown, they're both married. In fact, by one we have two grandchildren. But when they were little, there's a story where they came to their mom, Anna Marie, to ask some question. We don't remember what the question was, but she said, I don't know, go ask your father. And the response was, no, he takes too long. So that's just a word of warning for you this morning. What I want to do this morning is a couple things. I've been asked to speak for 2 hours. We'll get a break in the middle so we can all stretch out halfway through. And as I wrestled with what I would want to do for 2 hours, I decided to do this. The first hour or so, we will talk about the space experience and a little bit of the elements that you saw in that brief video introduction. Specifically, I will show some photography, a little bit of photography and a video that basically highlights my last time on orbit, which was from the fall of 2009 till the spring of 10, about 5.5 months on board. And I'll use that to kind of illustrate the mission profile of a typical long-duration flight. It'll be international in flavor, and you'll get a sense for what we're doing up there. By the way, we're continue to do it up there. We've had continuous human presence in space since the fall of 2000, and they're up there right now, orbiting the Earth 16 times a day, every 90 minutes to go around, see a sunrise, sunset, if they're looking out the window, continuing to do the work. So I want to introduce you to that and to what we're going through this video. There will be a little bit of time, I hope, for some Q&A. So as you think of questions, make note of them, and hopefully we can get to them. Then we'll take a break. And then I want to come back and through photography, my goal will be to take you to that vantage point and allow you to see the world in a different way from that vantage point through the lens of Scripture. So the first hour will be a little technical in the nature, and the second hour will be maybe closer to home for all of us as we encounter the challenges of the world as Christians and seek to serve our Lord faithfully in all of those challenges. So let's bring up my PowerPoint, if you will. That's the vantage point that we have from orbit. That's what the Earth looks like there. And if we go to the next slide, and then we can dim the lights perhaps. In fact, you can even dim these lights on me for this hour because I don't have any notes, and I'll be just looking at the screens myself. And I'll pick up some notes in the next hour because I do want to go to some scriptures. This is the International Space Station. This is a very rare opportunity we had to photograph the space station with a space shuttle docked. And that's what you see here in the upper left-hand corner of the stack there. And it was taken from a Russian Soyuz. Typically, when we had the space shuttle docked, we never had anything flying away from the space station, except for one time we had a Soyuz undock and returned to Earth with the space shuttle there, and that gave us an opportunity to get this very unique photograph. And I like to show this photograph because it helps tell the whole story a little bit in a summary format. We began, the vision of the space station began actually way back in the late 50s or early 60s. The vision for space exploration at that time basically envisioned building a space shuttle-like vehicle to put up a space station to then go to the moon and on to Mars. We ended up not doing it quite in that order. Of course, we know the story about going to the moon, that became a priority, and primarily because the administration at the time wanted to beat the Soviet Union at something. So it was driven by political goals and objectives, diplomatic goals and objectives, but it bypassed what envisioned to be a space shuttle or a space station and all of that. Went right to the moon. Once we got to the moon, everybody kind of lost interest. And those of you that everybody here, or most people here, remember the landing on the moon and all of that. And perhaps you also remember that there was a reduction in interest after that. In the 70s, the space shuttle was, development began finally, so a little bit out of order. And then if you remember in 1984, Ronald Reagan declared the program called Space Station Freedom, which was an international space station with partners from Canada, Japan, and Europe. And that got wallowed in Washington for many years, and Congress redesigned it, or forced redesigns of it several times. So it never got off view graphs in those days, the days before PowerPoint, remember that? For a long, long time, until about 1992, after the Soviet Union fell. Somebody or a group of folks got an idea of bringing this new fledgling Russian democracy, as we had hoped to be in our image of democracy in the United States, to bring them on board as a foreign policy objective, and it went from Space Station Freedom to the International Space Station. That was in 1992. And it had great political support to get funded by Congress and whatnot. We began our partnership and operations with the Russians, sending the space shuttle to the space station Mir, which was their space station. It was already flying from the late 80s into the late 90s. And we called that Phase 1. That's where we learned how to operate together with the Russians. And then finally in 1998, we launched the first element of the International Space Station. And as mentioned a few minutes ago, my first flight was on the Space Shuttle Atlantis in the spring of 2000. And that was when there were just 2 little modules up there in the space station before Expedition 1 got there. So we were in the beginning of assembly. We did not yet have a permanent presence up there. We didn't have the life support systems up there. It wasn't until the fall of 2000 that Expedition 1 launched. Of course, we remember the history through the 2000s. We had the Columbia accident that slowed things down as we recovered from that, and the loss of our friends and co-workers on Columbia, and fixing the problems that caused that accident. Then we resumed the assembly of the space station and finished it up in 2010. It took almost 40 space shuttle flights to do that, and an equivalent number of flights from our Russian partners. Also, after the Columbia accident, we started rotating crews because the shuttle was grounded. We started rotating crews on the Soyuz. So contrary to what you hear in the press over the last year or so with the retirement of the space shuttle, flying on the Russian rockets are not new. We've been doing it for the entire life of the program. So that's not new. They've been faithful partners, I would say, especially working through those years after the Columbia accident. And they've been great to work with, at least at the personal level, the program level. You know, it's a little bit different than at the political level. But this is the space station in this picture as it looks today with the space shuttle docked to it. It orbits the Earth 16 times a day. If you could put it on a scale, it would weigh almost 1 million pounds, 950,000 pounds or so. If you could lay it on the ground, it would almost cover 2 football fields. So it's huge. And the inside, the habitable volume, I like to say it's about the size of a large Texas 5-bedroom house. We live in Texas, sorry. So it's very roomy in there. The crew size right now is a crew of 6. That's the standard size. It takes 2 Soyuz spacecraft docked to support a crew of 6. Each Soyuz has 3 seats. Everybody has a lifeboat when they're on the space station, and for us, the lifeboat is the Soyuz spacecraft that we get there on, and also we return to Earth. So that's kind of the summary, the big picture. We continue to fly it. I mentioned it's international. I mentioned the Russians, the Canadians, the European Space Agency, and Japan are all partners with the International Space Station, and I've flown with representatives from all of those partner countries. What I'd like to do now is show a video clip, and it's about 18 minutes long or so, and it highlights a typical mission profile for a given crew. We typically fly now about 5.5 months on board the space station. We launch on a Russian Soyuz from Kazakhstan, halfway around the world, and we recover to Earth also in Kazakhstan 5.5 months after the flight. We rotate half the crew out at a time. So 3 people depart, and then a couple weeks later, 3 new people arrive, joining the 3 people that have already been there a couple of months. So that's the normal sequence of life on board the space station today. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and roll the video. Like I said, this video starts in fall of 2009. I was preparing for the previous couple of years to fly with my Russian crewmate Max Sarayev, as well as Gila Liberte, who was the last tourist to fly, as the media likes to call them. He flew up with us and returned with the crew that we were replacing. The final preparations, as I mentioned, are in Kazakhstan at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, which is where Yuri Gagarin and every Russian or Soviet cosmonaut has launched from since the beginning. So a lot of history there. About 2 days before launch, they rolled the rocket out from the hangar, as you see here, and put it to the launch pad and put it in the vertical position. And then do that 2 days, the final 2 days, preparing the rocket. In parallel, the crew is preparing, doing our final preparations for leaving Earth. They have some traditions there. One of them is signing the door to the crew quarters, in which we had been staying for about 12 days before launch. We had come from Russia down to Kazakhstan for the final preparations. On launch day, we get into our suits, our space suits here. There's a last shake with my wife, Anna Marie. I snuck in there. I was in quarantine, so I broke the rules there, but I thought, what are they going to do to me now, right? We took a bus ride out to the launch pad. There we are at the base of the rocket, waving a final goodbye, take an elevator up to the top of the rocket, strap in about 2.5 hours before launch, and then do the final checks of the rocket leading down to the launch time. And we launch at a very specific time so that about 2 days later we can rendezvous and dock with the International Space Station. Get down to a couple seconds before liftoff, the engines light up, and then right at liftoff time, we lift off from the launch pad and head downrange. It only takes a little less than 9 minutes to get to orbit. You pull about 4 times the force of gravity, so you feel 4 times the weight of your body as you go uphill. And after that time, you're going 17,500 miles an hour, so in less than 9 minutes. You're in Earth orbit, as I mentioned, orbiting 16 times a day, 1 orbit every 90 minutes. And as I mentioned, it takes about 2 days to catch up to the space station, and that's what the space station looked like from our vantage point as we approached it during the final stages of the rendezvous and docking. And here we are looking from the space station as we flew around it and aligned ourselves with the docking port on the very back end of the space station. Here's the final approach to that back end, where we will dock with a mechanical connection and then pull the 2 spacecraft together so that there are seals around a hatchway. Then we do pressure checks, open up the hatches, and come inside the space station, where we were warmly welcomed by the crew that had been on board for a while. We spent about a week or so handing over with the crew that we were replacing. And then we had a change of command, which is what you see here. And we helped that crew get into their Soyuz and return to Earth and their families after being on board almost 6 months. So here we are in October of 2009, underway. Life on station has a lot of parallels to life on the ground. We work a 24-hour day. We eat 3 meals a day. And every astronaut plays with their food. You turn into a kid again. Life on board is very busy. It's a big complex. It takes a lot of work just to maintain it, to fix it when it breaks, as well as doing all the experiments and the research that we're doing on board. It's also important that we exercise every day, and this is an equivalent of a weightlifting machine here. This is very important, very complex piece of equipment, but it does its job very well. We spend about 2.5 hours every day just exercising and cleaning up after the exercise. Very important, especially for the return to Earth. There's Max after he finished a couple-mile run there. How would you like to relax like that? Of course, Roman is kind of I called him the first clown in space. I was cutting his hair, and he was giving that look there. Nicole didn't trust me. She just let me cut an inch off. But hair still grows up there. We still have to do even those things. There's no barber shop to go through. We have some major events that occurred occasionally on the space station. In this case, this was a new module coming that had launched from Kazakhstan, a new Russian module, and docking automatically. Max is there monitoring the rendezvous and docking, so he could take over manually if the automatic system didn't work. Here it is as its final approach. It docked automatically. Everything worked just fine. So that was an example of assembling the space station. Like I said earlier, it took 40 or so, just shy of 40 space shuttle flights dedicated to the assembly, as well as an equivalent number of Russian launches to put this thing together. In the November of 2009, we had a space shuttle come visit us and the crew. The shuttle was typically docked to the space station for about 8 or 9 days or so. It would take about 2 days after launch to dock, and then we would welcome our friends on board. This particular shuttle had a lot of spare parts that they were delivering to the space station so that it could be supported for the years to come. As things fail, we can replace the failed components with new ones. It took 3 spacewalks during this dock time to accomplish the mission objectives, which primarily were putting these spare parts, and these are big things, big blocks outside, storing them outside for later use. It was a very successful mission, 3 spacewalks, a bunch of robotic operations, and we celebrated the success with a meal at the end. We also had one of my crewmates who had a baby girl born while he was on orbit. So life goes on Earth there, and there was a passing out of bubblegum cigars.
Relieve you of command.
The end of November 2009, we had another change of command. I took command of the space station as we said goodbye to 3 crewmates who had been with us or had been on board for several months. We also said goodbye to the space shuttle crew the next day. She was our last cargo transfer to this. She was returning home. She had been on board. Nicole Stott had been on board, and she was returning home with the space shuttle. So we said goodbye to everybody, and that dropped us down actually to a crew of 2 for about 3 weeks. And it was actually very nice. It was quiet on board the space station, having this huge orbiting complex with just 2 of us, my Russian crewmate who had arrived on the Soyuz a few months earlier, Max here, and me. So we enjoyed those 3 weeks. We continued to work on board, maintaining the space station as well as doing some experiments. Here's an example of one of the more interesting experiments we did. These 2 volleyball-sized robots, if you will, satellites, are programmed. It was an experiment developed up at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts.